Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the very strange story of Thomas Leithead and the murder of Patrick Rourke, which took place in the cells of North Shields Police Station in 1883. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. Thomas Leithead was born in North Shields in around 1866 to parents Thomas and Mary. He was one of at least two children. In 1883, Thomas lived with his mother, who was a widow, in Hudson Street in North Shields. In 1881, he had been employed as a plater's apprentice, but it's unclear if he was still working in 1883. And just prior to the murder, Thomas had been on a drinking binge lasting several days. There is very little information about the victim, Patrick Rourke. He was said to have been born in Ireland in around 1849, and his death information lists him as being between 33 and 34 years old. He worked as a fireman on board the steamer the SS Arthur, and on the day of his death he had just been discharged from the ship and received his final pay and gone out drinking in the North Shields area. On Wednesday, February the 22nd, 1883, Thomas Leithead of Hudson Street, North Shields, was arrested in the North Shields area for being drunk and disorderly and was taken to the police station. He was found to be rather noisy and disruptive, so he was moved to a cell on his own. It was known that he had been visiting pubs for several days and was suspected of suffering from delirium tremens. Later that night, Patrick Rourke was arrested in Union Street in North Shields, also on a charge of being drunk and incapable, and he too was taken to North Shields Police Station. He was placed in a cell alone at first, but he was later joined by Thomas Leithead. During the course of the night, Thomas was heard to shout and swear, and police officers would check on the two men, sometimes as often as every half hour. And at around 12:30, Sergeant Wilson visited the cell, and all was quiet, both men appearing to be fine at that time. But when he returned at around 1:30 a.m, he was not able to open the door and had to force his way in. And on entering the cell to check on the men, he now found Patrick lying on his back in a pool of blood, and he had several gashes to his neck and face, and a knife was later found in the cell. The police surgeon, Dr. Bates, was immediately sent for, and on examining Patrick, he stated he was already dead and had been so for some time before his arrival. There was no doubt that the wounds had been inflicted by Thomas, as he was the only other person in the cell, and he was now charged with the murder of Patrick Rourke. The inquest was held at the town hall in North Shields before Coroner Lynn on February the 23rd. Thomas was present at the inquest, however, he was not brought into the room until after the body of Patrick had been identified. He was behaving in a very strange manner. He would shout and swear, he was grinning at people and laughing, and the police officers who brought him to the inquest had to keep hold of both of his hands to try and restrain him at times. John Watson said he was the Deputy Superintendent of the North Shields Shipping Office, and he said he had identified the body as being that of Patrick Rourke, who was around 34 years old and worked as a fireman on board ship. He said he did not know where he lived, but he had previously lived in South Shields. On the morning of the 22nd, John said Patrick had received his discharge from the SS Arthur, and he had been given £5, 3 shillings and 10 as the balance of his wages. John said he had not seen him alive since then. It was at this point that Thomas was allowed into the room, and on seeing John he shouted out, "Take him away, the ship's going down, who can't work at sea, and you are a liar." This was the first example of some of the strange things that he would shout out during the inquest. P.C. Walton said he had arrested Thomas at New Quay in North Shields on the Wednesday afternoon for being drunk and disorderly, and he had taken him to the police station. He said he had been aware that Thomas had been drinking for several days and did not seem to be acting right. One of the jury at this point asked if Thomas was in a similar state to the one he appeared to be in now. However, P.C. Walton was not allowed to reply, as it was stated that the question was irrelevant and that Thomas was simply trying to deceive the jury as to his state of mind, and that the case would only be judged on what happened in the cell between the prisoner and the deceased. The juror was not happy about this and said his question was not irrelevant. He was simply trying to find out if Thomas was acting as crazy that night too. However, the coroner stated that they were only here to determine the cause of death, and again, the prisoner's involvement and his state of mind would be dealt with by a judge and jury. At this, Thomas shouted out, "I will have a cup of poison tonight." Sergeant Mansfield said he was on duty at the police station when Thomas was brought in. He said he was very disorderly and was sent to cell 1. He said that Thomas had been searched but no knife had been found. A member of the jury said if no knife was found, how was the murder committed? And Sergeant Mansfield's reply was that it had only been a brief search. He had not checked every part of the man's body. P.C. Clark spoke to confirm the statement of Sergeant Mansfield, adding that Thomas was very noisy and could be heard from the rooms above the cell, so he was removed to a different one, cell number 3, where he was the only person in that cell. Sergeant Watson said he had started his shift at around 9 p.m. He said all of the police officers who had given evidence earlier had by then left at the end of their shifts. At around 11:30 p.m, P.C. Craggs brought Patrick Rourke in for being drunk and incapable. He said he was placed into cell number 4 on his own. However, he said he later removed Thomas from cell number 3 and placed him in cell number 4 with Patrick. When asked why he had done this, he said he had been quiet for some time and cell 4 was a better cell with a fireplace in it, so was warmer as Thomas had complained of being cold. He continued by saying that he had visited the cell many times and Thomas had been quiet on all occasion and Patrick had been asleep on the bench. At this point, Thomas made such an outburst of shouting and swearing that it was asked if he could be removed, but the coroner said it was important for him to be there. One of the jury then spoke sternly to Thomas, telling him to be quiet, and he then settled for quite some time. Sergeant Watson then continued, saying that on a later visit to the cell he was unable to get the door open as Thomas was behind it. He had to force it open, and on entering he found Patrick was now lying on his back in a pool of blood. Inspector Phillips was sent for and Dr. Bates. He said that Thomas had blood on his hands and his clothes, and he said that later Inspector Phillips found a blood-stained knife in the cell. When asked if the knife could have been Patrick's, he said he had searched Patrick himself carefully and he did not have a knife upon his person when he was placed into the cell. A member of the jury then asked Sergeant Watson if he had been told to keep Thomas away from any other prisoner, to which he replied he had not. He had only been told to keep him in cell 3 until midnight. And no other police officer stated that Thomas had been deemed dangerous or that he should be kept alone and not allowed to mix with other prisoners. Inspector Phillips said he had been called to the cell at around 1:30 a.m. He found Thomas standing next to the fireplace and Patrick was lying on his back with a large gash on his neck and several other wounds. He said he asked Thomas, "What is this you have been doing to this man?" And he said Thomas replied, "I thought he was going to kill us and I knifed him." He said he then asked Thomas where the knife was and he told him it was near the fireplace, and this was where he found it, and he said it was wet with fresh blood. He said the blade of the knife had been broken, but was still sharp. At this point, Thomas shouted out, "Speak higher, you hour-slar, that knife belongs to me. That is the one that did it. It was not me that did it." P.C. Craggs was called and he spoke of finding Patrick Rourke at Union Quay. He said he was drunk and not able to look after himself, but he did not have any injuries of any kind on his body. Mary Jane Leithead said she lived in Hudson Street and Thomas was her son. She said the knife produced belonged to her son. The blade had been broken when he had tried to open a door with it. At this point, Thomas began shouting again. He was calling his mother an idiot and telling her, "If aught happens to us, it's you that did it." It must be added here that at a later court hearing, Mary attempted to change her evidence, stating that the knife did not belong to her son. The blade, she said, was the same, but the handle had been changed. It's not clear why she made this strange change to her evidence. Perhaps it had been the outburst from her son at the inquest, but it would seem that no one believed her, and her first evidence was the only evidence that would be counted. Dr. Bates said he had been called to the police station in the early hours of February the 23rd. He said he found Patrick in a pool of blood and knew at once that he was dead. He said he had many cuts to his face and neck. One wound had penetrated the brain, and it was wide and deep enough for his finger to fit inside it. He said he had also performed the post-mortem on the body of Patrick Rourke. He said many of the wounds to his neck were deep and one had severed the jugular vein. He said it had been a very violent attack. Patrick's hands had also been slashed and many of the wounds had been done with great force. In his professional opinion, any one of the large cuts to his neck would have caused his death due to blood loss. And when asked, he said the knife produced would have easily caused the wounds on the body of Patrick Rourke. The coroner then addressed the jury. He had some difficulty in talking to them, as Thomas kept shouting out, saying things such as, "My knife stabbed him, and that's a lie, I never stabbed anyone in me life." However, the coroner continued his speech, with outbursts continually coming from Thomas, saying that the evidence had shown that the knife produced was capable of causing the wounds. But it was for the jury to decide if this had been murder or manslaughter, but he felt they could only really come to one verdict in this case. He said they were not there to determine the prisoner's state of mind, only to determine his guilt or innocence. The jury retired for 15 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of wilful murder, and Thomas was committed for trial and removed to Newcastle Prison. The funeral of Patrick Rourke had taken place on the morning of February the 23rd. It had not been reported in the papers, and it was a simple service with no one in attendance. It is not clear why the funeral was kept quiet. Patrick was buried in Preston Cemetery, but I did not find any evidence of a headstone for him anywhere in the cemetery. The trial was set to take place in April of 1883, and it would no doubt have been held at the Moot Hall. Thomas had to be carried into the courtroom and placed in the dock. However, he was now much quieter than at the inquest and did not shout and swear. But before the trial was even to begin, the prosecutor stated that it had been brought to his attention that Thomas had been found to be of unsound mind, and it was for the judge and the jury to decide if he was capable of standing trial. Nicholas Hardcastle, the surgeon of Newcastle Prison, said Thomas had been in his care since the inquest. He said he was not able to understand anything that was said to him and did not seem to understand what was going on. In fact, in his opinion, he was in a state of idiocy. He had to be dressed, fed and attended to like a child. He said on his arrival at Newcastle Prison he had been very loud and disruptive, and for a time he had got much worse, but then he slowly became more subdued. His professional opinion was that he would not get better and that he had no understanding of his current situation. At this point, the judge spoke to the jury, saying that he did not feel any further evidence was needed in regard to the state of mind of Thomas Leithead, and that they must now consider their verdict. And the jury, without leaving the courtroom and after a short consultation, came to the decision that the prisoner was insane and could not be tried for murder. The judge then stated that Thomas should be kept in prison for the rest of his life, and he was then returned to Newcastle Prison. Thomas, however, would not remain in Newcastle Prison for long, as by the end of April he was transferred to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, and he would remain there for the rest of his life, being found there in both the 1891 census and the 1911 census. Thomas died in 1918 at the age of 52 without ever having been released. And as expected, I did not find any evidence for a headstone for Thomas. This was an absolutely tragic story. There was no evidence to suggest that Thomas had been suffering from any kind of insanity prior to the murder, as no one came forward to suggest that he had behaved oddly before, and he had had in the past jobs. And if he had made outbursts like he had at the inquest in his normal daily life, then surely it would have been unlikely that anyone would have employed him. There is, of course, the possibility that his drinking binge of several days prior to the murder had somehow altered his state of mind and led him to attack an innocent man in the belief that he was about to attack him, though this is hard to believe when all the evidence from the police officer stated that Patrick was asleep the entire time he was in the police cell. Perhaps this whole thing could have been avoided had Thomas not been moved into the cell with Patrick, but as no one had said he must be kept alone, can the police officer who moved him really be blamed, especially as at that point Thomas had become quiet and was not being disruptive? Was the outcome the correct one? Well, despite those at the inquest believing that Thomas was simply trying to fool them, it seems he was indeed insane, and I think the judge and jury made the correct choice not to allow him to stand trial. But thankfully he was not set free, but confined in the asylum until his death. But what do you think? Do you think it was simply the drink that altered his mind and made him attack an innocent man in such a savage way? Or do you think he may have had problems long before this? Do you think the judge and jury were correct to find him insane? Or do you think he should have been tried for murder? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very strange and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.